It is early morning in the city of Jezreel. A woman stands at an upper window of the palace. She is old now, not frail, not broken, but old the way a general gets old, battle-worn and entirely unafraid. She has heard the news. She knows what is coming. A military commander named Jehu is riding hard toward this city, and he is not coming to negotiate. She does not run. She does not hide. She sits down at her mirror, and she paints her eyes. She arranges her hair with the care of a woman who has always known that how you die is as important as how you lived. And then, composed, precise, deliberate, she walks to the window. She is going to look the man who is coming to kill her directly in the face. This is not a story about a woman who lost control. This is not a story about weakness. This is not a story about what happens when women have too much power. This is a story about what happens when a nation hands its soul to someone who was never afraid of God, and what it costs when that bill finally comes due. Her name is Jezebel. She has been queen of Israel for more than 20 years. She has built a religious empire inside a nation that belonged to Yahweh. She has funded 850 pagan prophets from the royal treasury. She has hunted down and killed the prophets of the living God, systematically, deliberately, as policy. She once sent a death threat so precise and so cold that it shattered the courage of the prophet who had just called fire from the sky. She is the most dangerous woman in Israel and Apos' history. She is also the most misunderstood. Most of what you have heard about Jezebel is either incomplete or wrong. She was not a temptress. She was not a seductress. The words used against her in the Bible, the word that has been translated as in quote, harlot in quote, and in quote, whore in quote, for 2,000 years, have almost nothing to do with sexual immorality and almost everything to do with something far worse. We will get to that. And there is one moment in this story that almost nobody talks about. It is that final morning. The painting of the eyes. The arranging of the hair. What she says when she looks out the window at the man with swords and soldiers behind him. That moment, that specific, strange, unsettling moment, is the key to understanding everything she was. We will get there. But not yet. First, you need to understand where she came from. Because Jezebel did not arrive in Israel as an accident. She arrived as a strategy, a political alliance between two kingdoms, sealed by a marriage, that cost Israel more than anyone at the wedding understood. To understand Jezebel, you have to understand her father. Her father in Apos' name was Ethbal. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing in the 1st century AD, describes him in detail. Ethbal was the king of the Sidonians, but before he was king, he was a priest of Astarte, the Phoenician goddess. And before that, he was an assassin. He murdered the previous king, seized the throne, and ruled for 32 years. Jezebel was his daughter. She was not raised in a home where power and religion were separate things. She was raised in a palace where they were the same thing. Her father was both high priest and head of state. The gods he served were the gods of the dynasty. The dynasty was sustained by the gods. This was not corruption, by her understanding. This was the natural order. Here in Apos, that's what most people miss. When Jezebel came to Israel as Ahab and Apos' bride, she did not come to cause trouble. She came prepared. She was a Phoenician princess of the highest rank, trained in the administration of a theocratic state. The marriage was a political alliance between Israel and Phoenicia, trade routes, military cooperation, access to Sidon and Apos' seaports. It made sense on paper. What nobody accounted for was who she actually was. Ahab did not marry a woman who would adapt to Israel and Apos' religion. He married the daughter of Baal and Apos' chief priest. And she brought her religion with her, not as a personal preference, but as a state policy. The Hebrew name Jezebel comes from the Phoenician name Izabel. Most scholars read it as a liturgical cry in the Baal worship cycle. End quote. Where is the prince? End quote. Asked during the ritual period when Baal was believed to be dead, gone underground, and the worshippers were calling him back. Her very name was a prayer to a god who was never there. She arrived in Israel, and she went to work. Within the first years of her influence, she had established 850 prophets of Baal and Asherah at the royal table, funded by the crown, sustained by Ahab and Apos' tax revenue, resident in Israel as the official religious establishment. This was not a small personal religion. This was state infrastructure. This was what it looked like when a nation and Apos' government decided which God was real. But Yahweh already had prophets in Israel, and Jezebel knew it. She did not ignore them. She did not debate them. She hunted them. 1 Kings chapter 18 gives you a single detail that opens a doorway into what those years were like. A man named Obadiah, who managed Ahab and Apos, household, had taken 100 prophets of the Lord and hidden them in caves. 50 in one cave, 50 in another. He fed them bread and water while Jezebel and Apos' forces were searching. 100 prophets, hidden in caves, fed in secret to keep them alive. That is what she had built. A system so thorough, so persistent, so well organized, that the men who spoke for God had to disappear underground or die. You need to sit with that for a moment. This was not a passing wave of persecution. This was policy. This was a queen who understood that if you want to replace a nation and Apos' God, you start by silencing everyone who speaks for the old one. And she was almost right. Almost. Because there was one man she could not catch. His name was Elijah. He came from a place called Tishbe in Gilead, a region so unremarkable that most maps Dan and Apos include it. He was not royalty. He was not educated in any of Israel and Apos' great centers. He was a man from nowhere, carrying a word from God, and Jezebel could not find him. He had prophesied the drought. 3 years of no rain, no dew, no rain, and Israel was starving. Ahab had searched every nation for him. Jezebel had been hunting, and Elijah had simply been somewhere else, fed by ravens, hidden by God. Then came Mount Carmel. You know this story. 450 prophets of Baal, standing on the mountain. One Elijah. The challenge, call down fire. Whichever God answers, that is the real God. Baal and Apos' prophets called from morning until noon. They cut themselves. They danced. They bled. And the text says a thing that is almost unkind in its brevity. End quote. There was no voice, and no one answered. End quote. Elijah called once. Fire fell. Not just on the sacrifice, on the wood, the stones, the dust, and the water they had poured around the altar. All of it consumed. Then Elijah did something that would seal his fate with Jezebel forever. He had the 450 prophets of Baal seized. And he killed them. Every one of them. By the brook Kishon. The religious infrastructure she had spent years building, gone in a single afternoon. And this is where it gets remarkable. Jezebel and Apos' response was not panic. It was not grief. It was precise, cold, and immediate. She sent Elijah a single message. End quote. So let the gods do to me, and more also, if I make not your life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time. End quote. She did not send soldiers. She sent a threat, worded exactly to let him know she understood what had happened, that she was not deterred, and that she had already decided what came next. By tomorrow. His life, for the lives of her prophets. The most terrifying thing about that message is what it did to Elijah. This man had just stood alone against 450 men. He had prayed, and fire came from the sky. He had prophesied a drought, and a drought came. And when he received Jezebel and Apos' message, he ran. 3-day walk into the wilderness. Collapsed under a broom tree. And quote, "It is enough, Lord. Take my life. I am not better than my fathers." End quote. He wanted to die. That is the weight of her. Not armies. Not force. A message. One sentence. And it broke the man who had just shown Israel who the real God was. The word the prophets used for what Jezebel practiced. The word translated in quote, harlotry in quote, and in quote, whoredom in quote, for 20 centuries, is the Hebrew word zana. And here is what you need to understand. In the prophetic literature, zana almost never refers to personal sexual immorality. It refers to spiritual betrayal, running after other gods, treating Yahweh as one option among many. Her sin was not what she did in her bedroom. Her sin was what she did to a nation and Apos' soul. She made Baal a state religion in the land of the God who parted the Red Sea. That is the harlotry the prophets were screaming about. And for a moment, for one terrible, disorienting moment, it looked like she was winning. There is a man in this story who gets 11 verses. His name is Naboth. He is not a prophet. He is not a priest. He is not a general. He is a landowner from Jezreel who had a vineyard next to the palace. A piece of land his family had worked and passed down, generation to generation, under the law that God had given Israel. Under that law, land was not just property. It was inheritance. It was identity. It could not be permanently sold outside the family. Ahab wanted the vineyard. He offered a fair price, or a better vineyard in trade. Naboth said no, not because he was unreasonable, but because the law of Moses said the land belonged to the tribe in perpetuity. He was following the law of his God. Ahab went home, lay down on his bed, turned his face to the wall, and refused to eat. He sulked, and Jezebel found him there. Pay attention to this. Her question to Ahab is one of the most chilling lines in the entire Old Testament. She says, and quote, "Do you now govern Israel?" End quote. It is not comfort. It is contempt. She was essentially saying, you are a king. Act like one. And if you want and oppose, I will. She wrote letters in Ahab and Apos' name. She sealed them with his seal. She sent them to the elders and nobles of Jezreel with specific instructions. Proclaim a fast, seat Naboth at the head of the assembly, bring in 2 false witnesses to accuse him of cursing God and the king, and then stone him. They did exactly what she said. Naboth was a man who did nothing wrong. He followed his God and Apos' law. He said no to a king. He was dead within days, his name destroyed, his land seized, his family left with nothing. And Ahab went and took possession of the vineyard. 3,000 years separate you from Naboth. The feeling doesn't and Apos. You have watched an institution be turned against someone who did nothing wrong. You have seen the machinery of authority used to silence, to shame, to destroy. You have watched someone in power decide that the rules Don and Apos apply to them, and watched everyone below them comply. You have felt the particular helplessness of watching it happen and knowing there is nothing you can do. And you have wondered, in those moments, whether God was watching. He was. Because the moment Ahab stepped into Naboth and Apos' vineyard, Elijah appeared. Not summoned. Not invited. Simply there. End quote. Have you found me, O my enemy? End quote. Ahab said when he saw him. Elijah and Apos' answer was one of the most devastating declarations in the prophetic tradition. He told Ahab exactly what was coming. The death of his dynasty, the end of his line, the judgment on every male of his house. And then he said these words about Jezebel. End quote. The dog shall eat Jezebel by the wall of Jezreel. End quote. Not buried. Not mourned. Eaten. This was not poetry. This was not metaphor. This was a specific, geographic, public prophecy. Her name, her city, her end. She would have known. In a palace, nothing stays secret. She would have heard what Elijah said. She would have known the prophecy spoken against her in Naboth and Apos' stolen vineyard. She had 20 more years to live, and she did not change anything. Ahab died in battle, an arrow between the joints of his armor. His blood pooled in the chariot and ran down onto the floor. Dogs licked the blood from the chariot floor at the pool of Samaria. Exactly as Elijah had said. But Jezebel did not die that day. She outlived her husband. She survived the reign of her son Ahaziah. She was still alive when her second son Joram took the throne. She had been queen of Israel and queen mother of Israel for more than 2 decades. She had watched one prophecy come true and she had not moved an inch. Then a military commander named Jehu was anointed by a prophet of Yahweh with a single instruction: destroy the house of Ahab. Jehu killed Joram. He killed Ahaziah of Judah. He was riding hard toward Jezreel. And Jezebel heard he was coming. Here is what nobody tells you about that morning. In the ancient Near East, a queen who was about to be captured or executed had 2 options. She could surrender in grief, tearing her clothes, removing her ornaments, going to meet her captor as a suppliant. Or she could die as a queen, dressed, composed, unbroken. Jezebel chose to die as a queen. The words used in the Hebrew are deliberate. She painted her eyes. The word suggests kohl, the dark mineral pigment used by women of rank throughout the ancient Near East. She arranged her head, and she looked out the window. This is not vanity. This is not seduction. This was a woman who had been a queen for more than 20 years, who had built a religious empire, who had broken prophets and bent kings. And she was not going to die looking like a prisoner. She was going to die looking like what she was. She looked out the window and called to Jehu. She called him Zimri. Zimri was a military commander who had assassinated a king of Israel and seized the throne, and then held it for exactly 7 days before the people rallied against him. He burned the palace down over himself rather than surrender. She was saying, you are nothing. You are weak. You will not last. It was the most composed insult in the entire Old Testament. Jehu looked up at the window and called out, and quote, "Who is on my side? Who?" End quote. 2 or 3 eunuchs looked out from behind her. Jehu said, and quote, "Throw her down." End quote. And they did. Her own servants. The people who had eaten at her table, served in her palace, lived in her household. They threw her out the window. She hit the ground. The horses trampled her. Jehu went inside to eat. When he remembered, after he had eaten and drunk, he said, "Go and bury her. She is a king and Apos' daughter." They went to bury her. They found only her skull, her feet, her hands. Dogs had eaten the rest. You have been in a room with someone like Jezebel. Someone who uses authority without accountability. Someone who forges narratives the way she forged letters. Someone who can look you in the eye after destroying something innocent and feel nothing, because in their framework, they are right, and you are in the way. Someone who goes down insisting on their own dignity, never once asking whether they caused any of it. You know that feeling. The particular helplessness of standing outside a palace window, knowing what is inside, knowing nothing you do will make it stop. God saw Naboth in that vineyard. God saw Obadiah hiding 100 men in caves. God saw every prophet who ran. He was watching all of it. There is a reason Jezebel and Apos' name appears one more time in Scripture, not in the historical books, but in the book of Revelation. In chapter 2, verse 20, the risen Christ speaks to the church at Thyatira. He says, and quote, "I have this against you, that you tolerate that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess and is teaching and seducing my servants." End quote. He uses her name as a category, not because a woman named Jezebel was literally in that church, but because the thing Jezebel represented, the use of spiritual authority to lead people away from God, the tolerance of false worship under the cover of legitimate power, that thing was alive and well in the first century church. And Christ was saying, "You see this? You know what this is. Do not tolerate it." Her name became a warning that outlasted her by 1,000 years. Here is what this story leaves you with. The first thing is this: Jezebel was not stupid. She was not weak. She was not a fool. She was one of the most strategically sophisticated political actors in the entire Old Testament, and God dismantled every structure she built, exactly as promised, exactly on the timeline he announced, down to the specific geography of her death. Her competence was real. His sovereignty was more real. The second thing is this: the Jezebel spirit is not a personality type. It is not something that belongs to women with strong personalities, or women who lead, or women who know their own minds. It is what happens to anyone, man or woman, who uses power without accountability and treats human beings as obstacles between them and what they want. Any institution, any church, any family, any workplace can become a place where Naboth and Apos' vineyard is taken while Ahab sulks and the elders comply. The warning is for all of us. And the third thing, the thing I want you to carry out of this: she painted her face for death. She spent her last hour in preparation. Not prayer, not repentance, not reconsidering anything. Just presentation. Just the performance of who she had always been. In the final minutes, she had left to perform it. And I want to ask you something, quietly, before this is over. What are you painting your face for? What are you building? What is the structure of your life designed to protect? Is there something in your life that has the shape of a Jezebel? Not a person, but a pattern. Something you have given power over you, or something you have used power to protect, that you know, somewhere in a quiet place, God is watching? He was patient with Jezebel for 20 years. He was not absent. He was not indifferent. He was not blind to Naboth, or the 100 men in caves, or Elijah running alone into the wilderness, or the thousands of ordinary Israelites who never knew which God was real anymore, because their queen had made Baal the official answer. He saw all of it. And on the morning she painted her eyes to meet her end, she found out, you cannot outlast the one who never sleeps. Tell me something in the comments. You Don and Apos, have to name anyone. Just say, I know her. Or, this is my Naboth moment. Or, God saw me in the vineyard. Tell me where you are in this story. Because the God who saw Jezebel sees you too.